I want to start by introducing the subject on which I'm speaking, which was, as the rabbi mentioned, a subject that was really near and dear to Marty's heart. The origins of this were just over a year ago. I was in New York, and I was asked by a synagogue in Manhattan to serve as scholar in residence and to give a talk there about the Arab Spring and what it meant for the West and for Israel. And I sat down because my area is not foreign policy. My area is really democracy, democratization, constitutional politics. But I sat down and made a roster of all of the positive elements of the Arab Spring and all of the negative elements. And as I saw it at that point, which was less than a year into the Arab Spring, in the short term and in the medium term at least, there was nothing good about the Arab Spring, not for the Arab countries where it was clearly not bringing about democratization, not for the West because it was bringing to power Islamic regimes that were fundamentalist and strongly anti-Western, certainly not for Israel, where even then it was clear that in country after country there would be greater antipathy towards rather than understanding of Israel as the Jewish state. And so I made this long litany of all of the negative elements of it. And I thought, wow, this is going to be one depressing Seudah Shlishit talk that I'm going to be delivering at this shul. Everything is bad. Who's going to ever want to invite me? Who's going to want to feed me after that? So I called up my friend Dan Shiftan in Israel. He was at home in Givatayim, a suburb of Tel Aviv. And I said, Dan, let me read out to you what my analysis is and tell me where I'm wrong. So he listened to the entire thing. He said, well, you're mostly right, but I think you're overly optimistic. It's actually worse than what you're describing. And I said, okay, so now we actually have a serious question, which is, if this transformational development within the Middle East is cutting so strongly against the interests of Israel, and Israel was in a precarious situation before that, because before the Arab Spring, we had the possibility of Iran going nuclear. And before the Arab Spring, we had the European Union and most of its constituent states increasingly against the idea of nation states in general and an Israeli nation state in particular. So I asked very simply, so how are we going to survive this? And how are we going to continue to be thriving? And how are we going to continue to be a light unto the nations? And there ensued a very serious conversation on the subject of what are those incredible core strengths that Israel possesses that have enabled us to be as successful as we've been. To my mind, we are literally the great success story of the 20th century, the greatest success story of the 20th century and of the early 21st century. What are those characteristics? Are they becoming even stronger over time? And what can we do to nurture them to make sure that in the next generation and in the next generations, Israel continues to be that fountain of strength and that symbol of hope for all of us? And we spoke about a few issues. One of them, which Dan mentioned, was that Israel, according to certain data that he had read, was actually a very optimistic country. Now, those of you who have met Israelis might be somewhat puzzled by that, because as optimists go, we are the stealth weapon of optimism. You can't tell that we're optimistic until we arrive with our payload. But as I'm going to be submitting to all of you tonight, in fact, Israel is extraordinarily optimistic. We spoke about Israel having high birth rates, on which more later, both why that's good and why that's tied into optimism. We spoke about the resilience of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and we spoke about educational pioneers, especially in these pre-army leadership training institutes. I'll be speaking more about each of these towards the end of my talk tonight, but we talked about these areas, and in fact, as a scholar in residence, I then discussed those, and I've spoken about them briefly on some occasions since then, and actually for the last year plus, I've devoted the better part of my research time to focusing on these core strengths of Israel and understanding what are they and what we can do to make sure they continue unabated in the years and decades to come. And as it's turned out, the very foundation of this has been optimism. That is understanding that at the core of Israel is a fundamental belief that things are pretty good and they're going to become even better. And I could tell the entirety of the history of Israel for the last 64 years on the basis of this one characteristic, but I want to start with one story. And the story is of the declaration of Israel's independence, May 14th, 1948. All of us know the story. All of us know that the British mandate was running out on May 15th, and the provisional government in Israel made a decision to declare its independence. And because we know this after the fact, and because to us there never was a narrative that didn't have Israel declaring independence at that moment, we assume that this was muvan me'elav, as the Israelis would say. It was simply understood. It was self-explanatory. Of course they were going to declare independence. Otherwise, how could the story turn out the way we all know that it turned out? But in point of fact, there was a minyan of Jewish men and women sitting in Tel Aviv. They were cut off from Jerusalem because Jerusalem was cut off from the rest of Israel at that point. And on the shoulders of those 10 people of that minyan, an egalitarian minyan, as it happens, but on the shoulders of that minyan really rested the most fateful decision that the Jewish people had been called upon to make for at least a few centuries. And they listened to all of the evidence as for this period of May 11th, 12th, 13th. In came the diplomats, in came the generals, each one giving the pluses and the minuses of declaring an independent state. Right? The diplomatic type said, listen, the United States is basically against. They may or may not recognize that state, but their preferred position would be for Israel to defer a declaration of independence because otherwise the Arab states are going to attack. And George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, who was referred to by the president of the time, Harry S. Truman, as the great one of the generation. He was widely viewed as the greatest World War II general, one of the greatest men of that era, perhaps of any era in American history. And he had point blank told the Israeli military leaders, it's nice that you believe you're going to win, but you have to understand there's at least as good a chance that you're going to lose. And if you declare your independence and lose this war, there will not be a state, and you'll never be forgiven by Jewish history. And they heard that from George Marshall, and then they brought in Yigal Yadin, who most of us know, of course, as the great archaeologist of Masada, but he was also one of the leading military figures in Israel's War of Independence. And so this minyan of decision makers said to him, well, if we declare independence, what's the chance the Arab states will go to war? 100%. What's the chance that we're going to win that war? And he said to them, well, if we're being honest, it's 50-50. If we're being very honest, it's less than 50-50. And against that background, these 10 people had to make their decision. Now, little known story is that a couple of these people were really diehard socialists, and so diehard that they sought guidance from outside of Israel, from the political figure from the 1930s who was considered the grand old man of socialism, Léon Blum. Léon Blum, who had been the prime minister of France, he was so famous that Hitler couldn't murder him. And he was housed in a tiny hut on the edge of a concentration camp during the Holocaust. In that camp, his brother and other members of his family were murdered. And but he observed the Holocaust from what could be described as a bird's eye view of one of its ghastliest elements. Now, Léon Blum, and I assume everybody here has written at least a master's thesis, if not a doctoral dissertation, about Blum's foreign policy. But since some of those dissertations might have been written a few years ago, I'll just refresh your memory. He said very famously in 1936 and 37 as Prime Minister of France that war is not worthy of any great civilization. You should never fight a war. And nonetheless, these socialist leaders of Israel came to him and said, listen, we have to make a decision. Do we declare independence or do we not declare independence? And Blum, having seen everything he had seen, having been the great pacifist, the great internationalist, the great believer in universal values, and therefore the least likely person to support a Jewish state, and certainly a Jewish state that would be born out of warfare, explained to these political neophytes, listen, I've spent my life in politics. And when you're in politics, striving to be a statesman, one of the things that you come to understand over time is that there are certain moments where you have an opportunity that might never be repeated. Certain moments, if you act and if you seize history by the horns, then you can really transform your people and the world. And if you don't, if you miss that moment by a day, by a week, by a month, it's lost. The Jews in Israel are at one of those moments. He explained to them that if they pushed it off because they were asked to defer it by some number of weeks, the opportunity might never repeat itself. And he understood the dangers better than anybody. But he said, and in the words they translated it when they came back to their colleagues, Achshav o la'olam lo. It is now or never. You will succeed because you must succeed. And armed with that faith, those people decided, by the way, by a vote of 6-4, to declare independence. And Ben-Gurion, who was a great man and a great statesman, said, we now know how the vote has turned out. We're going to declare independence. And when people ask me, the beleaguered people in our nation ask me, are all of us in this together? I want to be able to say that it was unanimous. So we now know the outcome. I'd like to have a revote. And it passed 10-0. Now, on the strength of that optimism, Israel was born. But this is not a story about the founding of Israel. Because that kind of optimism, to believe that you can do the impossible because you must do the impossible, that you can do the impossible because last year and a decade ago, you and your people succeeded in doing the impossible, that optimism has been at the very core of what it is meant to have a Jewish state. And so when I've been researching on the subject of, are Israelis optimistic? How can you tell? What does it mean? What are the causes? What are the consequences? I'm not looking at some trivial question of, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? It's actually, for Israel, maintaining that core optimism is an existential need. And were we to lose that optimism, I believe we couldn't sustain the state. So, given the importance of the subject, I thought it was worth looking into. And the results have actually been quite good, because I prefer to have good news to share rather than bad news. And on this particular subject, as you are going to be seeing, with a very, very, very large number of charts, and more numbers than most of you who are not economists or accountants have looked at in some time, you're going to be seeing that Israel is one of the leaders in the world in optimism. And I don't just mean like it looks optimistic to me, but things that you can really measure in a serious way. And it's possible that we're actually the most optimistic people in the world. So with no further ado, let me begin with a crash course in what is called in the discipline happiness research. It turns out that I am not the only person on this earth who thinks that it's extraordinarily important to see how happy, content, optimistic, satisfied, positive people are around the world, but in fact there's a whole discipline that's grown up around it. I'm going to teach you 2 abbreviations so that when you are trying to impress your friends, you can impress them with abbreviations that most people don't use but could become household terms within the next several years. First one is subjective well-being, or SWB as it's known to its friends. It's a term that's used for this broad category of happiness, fulfillment, optimism, and so on. And it's highly measurable, as we'll be seeing shortly. Now, one of the leading figures in this movement is Daniel Kahneman, who was born in Israel, and Israelis take great pride in his Nobel Prize in economics. He's been practicing his art at an extraordinary level. He is one of the, I know that in order to win one of the Nobel Prizes, you have to be a genius, but if there are levels of genius, he's sitting comfortably on the top one. He has revolutionized a series of disciplines, and one of them is this field of subjective well-being, together with a number of his colleagues, whom I'll be quoting in 1 or 2 cases. Now, the United Nations, which I don't usually cite favorably, but I will tonight as an exception, the OECD, which is the organization of the most developed countries in the world, and other organizations have been promoting research on happiness. They use it in international assessments, and it used to be that if you wanted to know how a country was doing, you would look at GDP per capita, you would look at income per household, you would look at standardized measures of housing or of educational attainment based on years of schooling and the like. But now increasingly you look at these questions of how do people feel about their lives? I mean, it's nice that I think it's great for a country to be extremely wealthy, but what if the people living in that country are very unhappy? Or what if the people living in a country are poor and it looks bad to me, but they're actually quite content with their circumstances? If you want to assess life in that country, you ought to at least take into some account what the people there think. And so, as it happens, the Gallup World Polling Organization has become the gold standard in this. Every year since 2005, they have run nationally representative samples of 1,000 or more respondents in 150 plus countries. 95% of the world population is covered in these surveys, and we're now going to see how, and this is an interactive lecture, so I'm going to start with a question for you, which is the following. You can look at it up there if you're visual types, or you can listen to it. But I actually want each of you to yourself to answer this question. And I'm even going to ask for a few volunteers so that we get a sense of what the scores might be, because this question, it's called the Cantrell Self-Anchoring Scale, not surprisingly named for a gentleman named Self-Anchoring. Kidding. Named for a gentleman named Cantrell. It was devised and published in 1965, and it's since become the standard question that is used to understand how people view their lives. So I want each of you to please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? Most people are not at the extremes on this. Most people tend to be clustered around a certain point. The average for the world is about 5.4. So if you're above a 5.4, you can feel that your life, at least as you perceive it, is ahead of most countries. Now, it turns out that once you have these numbers, you can have what at least statisticians consider to be a lot of fun. Regular people might also consider it to be. You can actually look at what the average is for a country. You can look at what the average is across the world. You can compare all kinds of things. And by coincidence, my PowerPoint has in it a chart, which is, it's a thermal map of world happiness. The brighter a country is, the higher they are on the Cantrell scale. The darker it is, the less happy they are with their lives. And you can get a picture of a certain pattern. Right? You'll notice that there are, in Africa in particular, you've got a number of fairly dark places. You have North America, which you would expect. You have Northern and Western Europe, which you would expect. You have Latin America, which you would not expect, on which more later. Latin Americans have a very positive view of their lives. But it gives you a sense. I'm sorry? They're having a party. That is one possible explanation. But in the Marty Kraar spirit of seeing everybody in the best light, I think it's more than just a party. I think there is something cultural that has enabled them to really see the best in their present and in their future. And when I've shared these results on a one-on-one basis with a number of people, and when I share them with Latin Americans, they say, of course, that's just what it's like there. We really do see the positive side. Now, what I now want to do is start looking at how Israel fares in this, because guy-like, I tend to see things as competitions that can be measured. And so I want to look at how Israelis, on average, have answered the question of how you see your life in the present. So you're looking at the top countries in the world, and you see here that Denmark is in first place by a nice margin, and you'll see they're really stars of this, or co-stars, along with a few other countries. They're at 7.8, which means if you did this, if you went to a Danish audience and asked these questions, you'd find a lot of people up in the 8, 9, 10 region. And if you visited Denmark or spoken to a lot of Danes, you'll understand why. They have a good life. What's interesting is that Israel is in 7th out of 157 countries. That puts us in the top 5%. And if you look at the countries above us, other than one obvious, the country that's surprising here obviously is Venezuela, because we're all thinking, well, if I were in Venezuela in 2011 and I had that government and that economy, I don't think I'd be at a 7.5. So One of the mysteries as still to be explained is why the Venezuelans view their lives much more favorably than we do, and it's not because someone's pointing a gun at them. These questions are asked in lots of totalitarian countries, and people give honest answers. But in any event, Israel, although it lacks many of the objective features of a lot of these other countries, is really up at near the very top of the world. Just for perspective, I put in the 157th country, which is Togo. It's down below 3. So it gives you a sense of how bad people there see their lives. The average across the board is about 5.5. So Israel's 2 points comfortably ahead of that world average. Now, you can ask this question, this latter question, not only for the present, but you can ask it for the future. And the truth is, it makes a lot of sense to ask it about the future as well. Because if you think your life is pretty good right now, but you're at the edge of a cliff, and it might not be so good when you get to the middle of that cliff or the bottom of it, well, then overall your happiness is not going to be as great. Overall your confidence won't be as great. Maybe you won't achieve as much. And so it makes sense to understand, well, now that we see how you see your present, let's take a look at how you see your future. And for this, you'll notice a new set of stars. Right? Panama, Brazil are up at the top. Some countries you might not expect, Nigeria, Oman, a lot of Latin American countries, Costa Rica, Colombia. And Israel holding up at 8. Now, does somebody here remember what was Israel's score for the present? 7. So we think of the future as being somewhat better than the present, but there are other countries who see the future as even rosier. But you know what? Out of 157 countries, if you're number 15, you're in the top 10%. And again, the Israelis were asked this in 2011, and they knew that 5 years from now there would quite likely be a nuclear Iran. And they knew that 5 years from now there could be major economic difficulties. And they knew that 5 years from now the Arab Spring would probably have brought about a more difficult local climate geopolitically. And they knew that the currents in Europe were against them. So they were asked this question about what's going to be 5 years from now. And they could have answered out of fear, but instead they answered out of confidence. I see a hand. Yes?
I'm surprised that the United States was on neither list.
It's an interesting phenomenon. The United States is not far off, and you'll see it on some of the lists. So here's what happens when you ask the question about the future. But you're obviously all understanding that if you want to get an even broader sense, why not ask the question about the past? Ask where did you stand on that scale 5 years ago? Because that gives you a sense of grounding. If you know 5 years ago things were pretty good, and now they're good, and in 5 years I think they'll be very good, well, that makes a certain amount of sense. If 5 years ago they were horrific, and now you think they're good, and 5 years from now you think they're going to be incredibly wonderful, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. Those are unrealistic expectations. And so the folks running the Gallup poll and lots of other people in this field said, let's take a look at the past as well. Now, we're going to look carefully at the past, but just before we do that, I want to do one other combination, which is the present and the future, right? Because those are the ways that most of us think. And so I want to look at the measure, it's called thriving. The measure of thriving, an individual is said to be thriving if he or she is at a 7 or more for the present and an 8 or more for the future. So now let's take a look at how countries fare in that. So again, this is based on data from last year. Denmark is in first place all alone. Right? Almost 3/4 of Danes are thriving by this standard. Then you have a cluster of countries, and Israel's doing incredibly well. Right? Top 3%. It's tied for 4th place in terms of thriving. Now look at the bottom of this. 140, 141. In Cambodia or Togo, 2% of the people are thriving. And you know what? If you visited those countries and talked to them, I think you would agree with with their assessments. Average for the world, about 1/4 of the people in the world are thriving, and about 2/3 of Israelis. So far, we're not doing so badly. Now I want to look now at the past to broaden this. And you look at where Israelis were, and yet again, pretty stunningly high results. Right? Higher or lower than where we were for the present? Lower, right? We were 7.4, we're 7.1 for the past, but we're tied for 3rd in the world. And again, if you ask, what was Israel? help me out here. It's 2011. You're being asked, how was your life 5 years ago? How were Israelis' lives in 2006? Anyone give us some main events from that year? Gilad Shalit, war in Lebanon. That was 2005. There was still the aftermath of it and the beginning of the sense that it had probably not succeeded politically, and it had certainly dislocated the lives of the people who were affected. There were, right? We had that year. I think Ariel Sharon had a stroke. We had new elections. We had endemic corruption. We had at that point a president who was under suspicion of rape. We had a prime minister who was being indicted, or was about to be indicted for a series of things, of which, by the way, most of which he's now been acquitted of. We had a finance minister who was indicted for financial corruption. We had tax authorities who were indicted for cheating in taxes. It was, right, 5 years ago. At that point, our lives had not been so good, but nonetheless, Israelis didn't see it that way. You're now looking at a slide that shows a composite past, present, and future, and it's rank ordered by the average of those. It basically shows overall, mushed together all the dimensions of time, and you see, yet again, Israel coming out very, very close to the top. All right, what we're looking at here is the different patterns for how your scores can be over past, present, and future. This is what I call a pattern of unrealistic expectations. These are countries whose future is so far ahead of their past that it's hard to imagine that they can actually be that successful, and they're setting themselves up for a fall. Last point I want to make before we begin the first of our discussions this evening, which is not only are Israelis strong in the present, strong in the future, and even stronger in the past, and not only are they extremely strong in the composite of those, but the even better news is that we're climbing. What you're looking at right now, the blue is for the Gallup poll. They did an average for 2005 through 2009. The, orange-red is for 2010, and the green is for 2011. And what you see is Denmark actually has dropped. Canada jumped up and then came back down. Netherlands came down and up. Sweden, also one of these kind of roller coasters. Slow and steady wins the race is Israel. It looks like steps going up. And in fact, there's lots and lots of other polls over the last decade that have shown that in Israel, our happiness, our optimism, our sense that the world is a good place and can be even better for us is growing strongly over time. In Israel, the leaders in optimism are actually the people between the ages of 15 and 34. So it's being driven by the generation that's been quite maligned, I should say, for lacking hope, for lacking vision, for lacking the strength of its forebears. But nonetheless, that generation has been is quite strong in this. Now, I want to throw out a question. Why is it surprising that Israelis' assessments of their lives are as positive as they are? Is anybody here surprised? Am I the only person who was surprised by these results? I mean, I wasn't that surprised tonight because I saw the PowerPoint before it was put on my computer. Despite fine books such as Startup Nation, which focus on the economic successes of Israel, Israel is actually not a terribly wealthy country when you compare it to most of the OECD countries. And what I want to flip through quickly right now is reasons that we should all be very surprised at how positively Israelis view their lives. So this is this is a lot of data, but it's very simple. The OECD and the countries that the OECD keeps track of are measured in all sorts of objective ways. How many rooms do you have per person. So for example, in Israel, we have 1.3 rooms per person, which is much lower than the average OECD countries. And if any of you have visited apartments or houses in Israel, know that the average size of these rooms is also quite small. So if you did it by square footage, we're all sleeping in bread baskets, more or less. And I mean, we have 1.3 bread baskets per person, but nonetheless, that's not a lot. And we just went down category by category to see where Israel ranks in these objective measures. And the answer is very low down. So if you thought that the quality of life is dependent on money, education, housing, the quality of the environment, Israel should be very low down, and yet we are this anomaly because we're quite high up. This is a very, very pretty chart that's worth showing just because of its aesthetic beauty. But its basic meaning is the following. You're looking at percentiles. So the higher you are in this chart, the higher you are in a particular thing. Red measures your self-perception, right? It's from the Gallup poll. What percentage of it's how you fare in terms of the percent of people who see themselves as thriving in that country. Green measures your objective quality of life based on the leading quality of life measures that have been published in the last several years. The only thing that you need to look at on the chart is look at the distance between red and green. Start with Australia. How great is the difference between the red and the green in Australia? They're all over each other, right? What it means is that Australians have a great life and they know it. The United States, which I promised would appear here, green and red are pretty close to each other. Americans think they have a pretty good life. They really do have a pretty good life. For two countries on this, you notice a big gap. Israel is one of them. Brazil is the other one. In those countries, we have some explaining to do. And we have to explain how it is. As it happens, since I'm not speaking at a Brazilian synagogue this evening, I'm going to focus on Israel. What I'd like to work with you on for the next several minutes is explaining how it is that Israelis have this view that is so much more positive than the objective reality would warrant. So, in order to do that, I want to ask you to think about something. Okay, when you rated your life, how long did it take you to do? Well, I can answer that for you because we were done within 15 seconds. There wasn't anybody asking for more time. How'd you do it? In general, when people do this, they don't think through 12 different categories and then sum them up and take the square root of the logarithm of it. They just get a sense. They picture the ladder. They picture themselves. They think about how they view their days. Now, the reason I pointed that out is because I now want to look at what happens if you did look at the specific areas of your life. And coincidentally, this has also been done by, it's a different survey, the Pew survey. Pew they got their 15 minutes of fame because they were the first poll to announce that Romney had gone ahead of Obama after the first debate. So it didn't turn out to be monstrously predictive, but it did get them a lot of headlines, and in fairness, they actually do some terrific work. So this is what happens. They did a survey of 25 countries in 2009, and you're looking here at what happens when you ask people how satisfied are you with your income, with your job, and with your family life. And if you look at each of these, elements, now look at where Israel fares in this. Out of 25 countries, we're number 13. Dead center, right? And 60% are satisfied with income, 69% with their job, and 81% with their family life. And the average of all of those is 70%. So if the way people thought about these things was by looking at how happy am I with each component, therefore that's how happy I am with the overall, you'd get a certain result. Now, it's very interesting to see who's right after Israel, right? We're neck and neck with the Palestinian Authority. But what I now want to look at that I think is very interesting, what happens when you compare how people view these individual components with how they view the overall. So the first column you're looking at here is what happens when you take the average of these specific, remember the term SWB, subjective well-being factors. That's the first column. The second column is people on the same survey were asked, how satisfied are you with your life in general? And they gave answers to that. And what I wanted to calculate was the difference. That is, how satisfied are people with their overall lives compared to the particular components? The theory being that, just as we heard, you have an overall personality. It says, I'm a 10, or I want to try to be a 10 on this. But if you're then asked very specifically, well, what do you think about your family life? What do you think about your job? What do you think about water pollution in your country, and so on? You might get much lower answers. And the higher the gap, I think, the greater is the ability of people in that country to abstract from a bad situation and to see it in its positive light. And if you had to pick a feature that you would want Israelis to have, it's the ability to see all of these individual components that aren't so good, and to say for the overall, Dayenu, to say for the overall, Baruch Hashem, to say for the overall, it's pretty good. And in fact, that's what you see on this. This measurement of the gap in the right side is, I think that is an nearly exact measurement of how positively people take their situation and map it into something much, much better. Interesting fact that I can't help but point out, there are 4 countries in which satisfaction with overall life is actually lower than satisfaction with the average components of that life. What do those countries have in common? They're Middle Eastern and they're majority Muslim. Now, that doesn't mean that Middle Eastern countries have to be negative, and it doesn't mean that Muslim countries have to be negative, but it's an interesting fact that in those countries, right, the Palestinian Authority you asked about each component of their lives, they're right up there with Israel. You ask them about their overall life, they are down near the very bottom of this. One other way to, there's one other way to look at it, and I'm now going to ask for the people who have been planted to pass out behind you these pieces of paper, because you're actually part of the research. Start on the positive side. I want you to start on the side in which you are asked, right? These are questions that are asked in the same polls. People are asked, I want to know about how your day was yesterday. And they're asked about 5 positive experiences that they might have had and 5 negative experiences that they might have had. And I want all of you to answer these honestly. It shouldn't take very long. I want to very quickly walk you through this because I see time is running, and I want to make sure we have time for discussion. Based on knowing that Israelis are at the very top of the world in terms of how they assess their overall lives, you would, I think, assume that they probably had a pretty good day yesterday, because there should be a very, very strong correlation between these. If you had a lot of positives yesterday and not many negatives, life's good, especially because these are subjective kinds of questions, right? They're not asking how many dollars did you earn yesterday. They're asking about worry and sadness and enjoyment and challenge and respect. So you might be surprised to see the higher up you are in this scale, the more it means that the people in your country gave positive answers. So Panama's in first at 85%. What that means is that the typical Panamanian gave positive answers to 4+ questions. It's 4 out of 5 would make it 80%. Anyway, take my word for it. The higher up you are, the better a day people had yesterday. Israel's in 85th place. We are in the lower half, which, I don't know, how many of you were surprised by that? It seems a little bit strange. I'll try to explain it in a moment. But now let's add to the surprise. What about negative experiences? For that, the higher your percentage, the worse you're doing. Because if you had 40%, give a yes. If you're at 40%, it means that your typical person had suffered from 2 out of these 5 things, and these are not pleasant things: pain, worry, and so on. Israel is in 140th place out of 156. We're one of so you ask people how their yesterday was, we're among the worst countries in the world for that. So you know where I'm going to go with this. I now want to look at that gap between how our yesterday was and what our assessment is of our life. The bigger that gap is, the more we're able to take a bad yesterday and turn it into a pretty good today and into a rosy tomorrow. What you see here is we've just created a score for combined positive. It's basically the more you've got the positives and the more you're missing the negatives, the higher your score. Israel's in 118th place, still not doing so well. What we then looked at is the gap between how your day was yesterday and how you assess your life today in the present. And on this, if you look at that right column, the higher your number, the more you are able to take a lousy yesterday and turn it into a pretty good today. Look at where Israel is. It's the only country in the world that has a positive number for that. Look at the gap between Israel and the second place country, which oddly enough is Iraq. Israel's about 8 points ahead of Iraq. Now, look at the gap between number 2 and number 3. How big is that gap? 0.1. The next gap, 0.4. Add them all up. Israel is more ahead of the country in second place than the country in second place is ahead of the country in 35th place. In the words of one of my mentors, the great humor writer Dave Barry, Israel's in first and nobody is in second. Right? Israel in this is the absolute leader.
But you're telling me that Thailand had the best score?
What I'm telling you, in the words of the Gallup World Poll, otherwise known to its friends as the GWP of 2011, the people in Thailand believe, when asked today, that they had the best day yesterday, at least measured by these particular attributes. You might say these attributes don't measure everything. For example, they don't ask, were you starving yesterday? They don't ask, was there a mugging on the street next to yours yesterday? Right? So you could say that they're only asking particular attributes. There's a reason for it, meaning these questions have been asked for dozens of years. There's a reason they ask these questions. They're generally predictive. By the way, Israelis, overwhelmingly after they finish their military career, they spend time in India, they spend time in Thailand. There's some reasons why. They spend time in countries where people seem to have a positive attitude towards at least the day-to-day affairs. Anyway, as I said, Israel's in first, nobody's in second. This is just another way of looking at the same thing. There's that line, that curve is what statisticians call a fit line. If you are above the curve, it means that your assessment of your life today is much better, or somewhat better, or way better than what kind of a day you had yesterday. If you're below it, it means that your yesterday wasn't so bad, but you view it quite negatively. So Israel is further above that line than any other country if you were to map out the distances. Again, it's just showing the same point, but in a graphical way. I want to summarize and move quickly to discussion, questions, and the like. What we've seen tonight is Israelis have a high and rising assessment of their lives in the past, in the present, and in the future. These life assessments are far more positive than is justified by objective factors. Israelis reach these assessments not by summing up the specific elements of their lives, but in a sense by almost ignoring those elements and mapping them into reading them in the best possible light. I started by talking about Marty Kraar as a man who brought out the best and saw the best in people. Israelis look around and see the best in everything going on around them, or in many of the things going on around them, and that helps them bring out the best in themselves. There are a number of consequences to this that I'm just going to touch on now, and I'm happy to discuss them further. As a result, and I would say basically as a direct result of this optimism and what the social scientists call a positivity bias, Israel has a positive immigration balance. We all are aware of many Israelis who leave the country, but net more people in general and Jews in particular move to Israel every year than the number who leave. Number two, Israel has the highest birth rate in the West, and it isn't even close. The United States and Ireland are just below what's called the replacement rate. Right? The replacement rate is you need about 2.1 kids per family. The U.S. and Ireland are the leaders in the Western world. They're not even at the replacement rate. Anybody know the bottom country in the Western world for birth rate? Italy is near the bottom, but it's not quite there. They've got some stiff competition, but you're in the right area. Spain is right in that competition, and the winner of it is Portugal. It's down about 1.3. So the whole Western world is between essentially disappearing rates in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, and barely hanging on rates in Ireland and the United States. Israel, looking just at the Jewish population of Israel, is at 3. Just think about it. The entirety of the Western world is arrayed in that gap between 1.3 and 2.1. The gap between Israel in first place and Ireland in second place is bigger than the entire gap for all the rest of the Western world. And I know you're all thinking, well, that's because there are Haredim, there are the ultra-Orthodox Jews. How many of you were thinking that? There we go. We got an audience who's all over this one. Even if you take them out of the equation, Israel's at 2.6, which means that it is further ahead of the number 2 country than the number 2 country is ahead of the number 20 country. So, and this is tied in very great measure to the optimism that Israelis have. When you're optimistic, you want to bring more people in the world. One of the interesting statistics that Israel does well on is when people are asked, do you think your children's lives will be better than yours? Most Western countries give a negative answer to that. Israel is one of the only countries in the West where people believe that their children will have a better life than they do. The same optimism, I'll get to you in just 2 minutes. The same optimism leads to high levels of entrepreneurship. People who have done studies of entrepreneurs have seen that they are not just optimistic, they're wacky optimistic, because the objective chances of any given new enterprise succeeding are very, very small. Yet entrepreneurs either don't believe those numbers or think that those numbers apply to everybody else. But when it's my company with my idea and my people, it's going to work. And Israel, as we know, if anybody here has not read Startup Nation, I expect you all to read it and file a book report with me by next week. It is a must-read book, and it shows, among other things, that Israel has the highest level of entrepreneurship, the highest number of NASDAQ-listed companies per capita. In absolute terms, there are more Israeli companies on the NASDAQ than there are companies from any other country except for the United States and China. And China, according to the last census, has a slightly larger population than Israel. The joke goes that Israeli prime minister, it might even be true, but Israeli prime minister speaking to his Chinese counterpart in the 1960s said to him, listen, between your people and our people, there are over 1 billion of us. Just imagine what we can do together. So in the NASDAQ, you actually see what we can do together. The last thing that I'll mention is educational entrepreneurship. Israel has a burgeoning of very innovative educational programs. I mentioned these pre-army leadership academies. I won't go into them, but I'm happy to discuss them. And because Marty Kraar, as one of his commandments to me, said, you are never again, Dan, to speak at any forum in which you don't at least say something about Shalem College, and not wanting to disobey him here in this sanctuary, I will mention that my colleagues and I have been pleasantly surprised at the positive attitudes of many people towards our efforts to launch Israel's first liberal arts college. And I think it's part of that same optimism. When you're optimistic, you believe you can try a model. It worked in the United States. We have some problems in Israel. Let's try that model and see what it can do for us. There are various causes of Israeli optimism. I don't want to go into them tonight beyond a sentence each. It has been shown around the world that religious people tend to be more optimistic than non-religious people. There's also some data from the United States, which is one of the reasons I wanted to circulate these papers, that American Jews are more optimistic than Americans of any other religion. In Israel, there's also a sense of national purpose. So even if yesterday was a lousy day, I woke up this morning knowing that I have the privilege of helping to build the reborn national state of the Jewish people, and that makes a whole lot of things feel much better. And finally, if for 64 years you've been doing the impossible, well, then you wake up today and you imagine you can do it today and tomorrow and the next day. So what would Marty have thought of all of this? Just to wrap it up, I mentioned 2 of Marty's great characteristics. He was the person who saw the best and brought out the best in everybody, and he was a person who deeply loved Israel. But when I gave a eulogy for him at a Shloshim event that we had at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, I mentioned one other characteristic. He was the most optimistic person I ever met. And so I thought it would be particularly appropriate in speaking about optimism in the country that he loved so much to do that here at an event in his memory and in his honor. And with that, I am open to comments, questions, vicious attacks, or anything else. So the question is, what's the comparison between the birth rate of Israeli Jews and the birth rate of Israeli Arabs? They're very close to each other and they're converging. The Jewish birth rate in Israel is about 3.0. The Arab birth rate in Israel, last I saw it, was about 3.3. If you looked at those figures a decade ago, the Jewish birth rate was 2.5, and the Arab birth rate was probably above 4. And if you looked at them a few decades ago, the Arab birth rate was somewhere in the 7s, and the Jewish birth rate was somewhere in the 2s. So I'm not wise enough to know whether recent trends are going to be continued forever, but they appear to be converging in the area of the low 3s. These are not small trends that you need a magnifying glass to discover. These are massive shifts in birth rates. Israel's birth rate has gone up from 2.5 to 3 in 1 decade, led, by the way, by an increase in the birth rate among secular Jews, among Russian Jews who when they first came to Israel, gave birth at the rate in Russia, which is a child every 3 centuries, more or less. And once I exaggerate slightly for television, and once they've assimilated within Israel, they give birth at the same rate as whatever religious group they're a part of. So the religious Zionist Russians give birth at the religious Zionist rate, and so on. And finally, there is an increase in the rate within the religious Zionist cadres, which I'm intimately familiar with. I have 6 kids, so we've helped bring the rate up. That 6 is not statistically significant for the country, but enough people doing that, and the birth rate goes up. I feel comfortable in the synagogue quoting one of the great sources of the Jewish tradition, which is a book called Ball 4, written by Jim Bouton, who was a great pitcher for the New York Yankees. And I say this as a diehard former New York Mets fan. So Jim Bouton describes that when he writes in this book, it's a diary of a year in baseball. It's the best book on baseball I've ever read, for whatever that's worth. It was the best book the first time and the best book the 10th time. He lived in Teaneck? For a while. Wow, so I'm really like being mechabedet hamakom here. So anyway, he writes that when he first came up to the big leagues, he walked across the outfield from the bullpen into the dugout at the start of the game, he would really get this tingling feeling that it was so special. And he writes, later in his career, he would occasionally forget to tingle, even though it really is special to be out there. Living in Israel is a lot like that, right? If we think about it even for a moment, we are witness to something that is not only the most incredible development of the 20th century, but it's also the coming to fruition of 20 centuries, of 70 generations of the Jewish people. And if we thought about it, we would literally tingle every morning that we get out of bed and are walking around in the land of Israel. And when you see Israelis take their not-so-good yesterdays and convert it to a very good today and a wonderful tomorrow, I think what they're doing is tingling. To a very large extent, because we know that there is a purpose to what we're doing. We're part of a great historical development. We're inspired by it, but we're also the next chapter in it. We're not inspired by somebody else's story. We're inspired by a story that we can not only tell, but also extend. I think that gives our life meaning. And as has been said, I think it's by Viktor Frankl, if a man has a why to live, he can put up with almost any how. And I've also heard it attributed to Nietzsche. But whoever it is who said it first and whoever it is who said it best, it's absolutely right. And I think Israelis have this happiness and they have this optimism, and they're able to sustain the state, lamrot hakol, despite everything, because of those elements. The question is essentially, how do you see, what kind of correlation do you see, what relationship do you see between the wealth of a country and the educational level in that country on the one hand, and the subjective sense of happiness and optimism in that country on the other? It's a complicated relationship, but broadly speaking, as the Jewish line would have it, it's better to be rich and healthy rather than poor and sick. And that's how most people see it. So if you look at the top countries in the world, Denmark is at the top in large part because it is a wealthy, fairly well-educated country, and by the way, with high levels of equality, low levels of pollution, low levels of government corruption. It really is a wonderful place to live. I mean, I'm never going to live there, but it is a wonderful place to live. So in general, there is a pretty strong correlation between the wealth in a country and the level of satisfaction that people in that country have. Education is much less clear. The more education you have, the more eloquently you can kvetch about what is wrong in your life. And that pattern certainly exists. On average, the more educated a country is, the higher it will be in subjective well-being, but that's mostly because education leads to higher incomes, and it's the higher incomes which then lead to greater satisfaction. If you control for income and you just look at education, it has a negligible impact. It's slightly positive, but it doesn't have a big impact. There are variations, and the variations are cultural, and that's what makes it interesting. You see countries that are relatively poor, where the people are happy, and that's wonderful. And you see countries that are relatively wealthy, where the people are less happy, and that's sad. And one hopes that lessons are learned from it. Anyway, again, I want to thank all of you, and especially to thank the rabbi. It really has been a pleasure being with you this evening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.